Eleanor Wilson had always been the type of woman who dressed for travel. Even at 65, she wouldn't dream of boarding a plane in sweatpants or sneakers. Today she wore a pressed navy pantsuit, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and pearl earrings that had been a gift from her late husband. The Atlanta airport buzzed with the usual chaos of a Friday afternoon. Eleanor checked her watch, still 2 hours before her flight to Denver. More than enough time, but Eleanor was never one to cut things close. Punctuality had been a core value she'd instilled in both her children, especially her son Thomas. She smiled to herself, thinking about seeing Thomas in just a few hours. 6 months had passed since his promotion to captain, and this would be her first time flying on a route he was commanding. Though she'd never admit it to him, she had specifically booked this flight once she learned he would be in the cockpit. "Excuse me, ma'am. Your ID and boarding pass, please." The security agent barely looked up as Eleanor handed over her documents. She noticed how the agent spent just a few seconds glancing at the white businessman's ID ahead of her, but now studied her license with unusual scrutiny. "Mrs. Wilson, what brings you to Denver?" the agent asked, a question Eleanor noticed he hadn't posed to the previous passengers. "Visiting my son," she answered politely, though she felt that familiar tightness in her chest, the one that appeared whenever she was singled out for no apparent reason. "And how long will you be staying?" Eleanor maintained her smile. "A week." The agent finally handed back her ID and boarding pass. Eleanor thanked him and continued through the security checkpoint. This was nothing new. At her age, Eleanor had lived through far worse than suspicious glances and extra questions. She had grown up in Alabama during times when water fountains were labeled for white and colored use. She had raised 2 black children in a world that often seemed determined to limit their potential. A few extra security questions were hardly worth her anger. After clearing security, Eleanor headed to the first-class lounge. Her son had insisted on purchasing her a first-class ticket. "Mom, you've flown economy your whole life while putting me through flight school. It's my turn now," he had said. Though Eleanor had protested it seemed an unnecessary extravagance, she had to admit the spacious lounge with its comfortable chairs and complimentary refreshments was a pleasant change from the crowded gate areas. She presented her boarding pass to the lounge attendant, a young white woman with blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail. "I think you might be confused, ma'am. This is the first-class lounge," the attendant said, not even bothering to look at the boarding pass Eleanor had placed on the counter. Eleanor gently pushed the boarding pass closer. "Yes, I'm aware. I'm flying first class to Denver today." The attendant frowned slightly before picking up the pass. Her eyebrows rose a fraction as she verified the information. "Oh, I see. My apologies, Mrs. Wilson. Please come in." Eleanor nodded and entered the lounge, choosing a quiet corner seat near a window overlooking the tarmac. She pulled out her phone to text Thomas, "At the airport now, see you soon." "Love you." His response came quickly. "Can't wait to see you, Mom. I'll be the handsome one flying the plane." "Love you too." Eleanor smiled, then opened her e-reader to the novel her book club was currently reading. The lounge gradually filled with more passengers, business people mostly, typing furiously on laptops or speaking in hushed tones on phones. Occasionally, Eleanor noticed sidelong glances in her direction, the unspoken question of what this older black woman was doing in the first-class lounge. She had grown skilled at ignoring such looks over the decades. People's assumptions about her were their problem, not hers. An hour before boarding, Eleanor gathered her belongings and made her way to the gate. The boarding area was already crowded with passengers waiting for the Denver flight. She found an empty seat and settled in, watching the gate agents prepare for boarding. A family with 2 small children sat down across from her. The little girl, perhaps 5 years old, stared openly at Eleanor with the innocent curiosity of childhood. "Hello there," Eleanor said with a warm smile. The girl smiled back shyly. "I like your necklace," she said, pointing to the simple gold chain with a small heart pendant that Eleanor wore. "Thank you, sweetheart. It was a gift from my son. I'm going to visit him today." "We're going to visit my grandma," the girl offered. "She has a swimming pool." That sounds wonderful, Eleanor replied. I bet you're excited about that. The girl nodded enthusiastically. Her mother glanced over, offering Eleanor an apologetic smile. I hope she's not bothering you. Not at all, Eleanor assured her. She's delightful. The mother relaxed, and they chatted briefly about their destinations until the gate agent announced pre-boarding would begin soon. Eleanor gathered her carry-on bag. She never checked luggage if she could avoid it, and stood near the priority boarding line. She watched as the flight crew arrived at the gate, heading down the jetway to prepare the aircraft. She wondered if she might catch a glimpse of Thomas, but he was likely already in the cockpit, going through pre-flight checks with his co-pilot. We will now begin boarding Southern Airways Flight 477 to Denver, announced the gate agent. We invite our first-class passengers, active military personnel, and those needing special assistance to board at this time. Eleanor stepped forward, along with a handful of other passengers. She presented her boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled and wished her a pleasant flight. As she moved toward the jetway entrance, a flight attendant standing nearby stepped directly into her path. Excuse me? The flight attendant said, holding up her hand. First class is boarding now. Eleanor blinked in surprise. Yes, I know. I have a first-class ticket. She held out her boarding pass again, though the gate agent had already scanned, and returned it. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Patricia, barely glanced at the boarding pass. I think you might be in the wrong line. General boarding will begin shortly. Her tone was polite but firm, as if she were explaining something to a confused child. Eleanor felt a flicker of irritation but kept her voice even. I'm in the correct line. I have a first-class ticket. She held the boarding pass closer to Patricia's face, forcing her to look at it. Patricia frowned slightly as she read the information. Behind Eleanor, other first-class passengers were beginning to line up, watching the exchange with varied expressions of impatience and curiosity. This does say first class, Patricia admitted reluctantly. But there must be some mistake. Did you upgrade recently? There's no mistake, Eleanor replied, her patience wearing thin. My son purchased this ticket for me weeks ago. Patricia's expression remained skeptical. And who is your son? Before Eleanor could answer, another flight attendant approached, a tall man with a kind face. Is there a problem here, Patricia? Patricia turned to her colleague. This woman claims she has a first-class ticket, but I think there might be a mistake in the system. The male flight attendant, whose name tag read David, looked at Eleanor's boarding pass. Everything seems in order to me. Mrs. Wilson, please proceed on board. We're happy to have you flying with us today. Patricia's lips tightened into a thin line, but she stepped aside. As Eleanor moved past, she heard Patricia mutter to David, I was just doing my job. You never know these days. Eleanor pretended not to hear as she walked down the jetway. She had encountered people like Patricia throughout her life, people who looked at her and immediately made assumptions based solely on the color of her skin. At 65, Eleanor was too tired to confront every instance of prejudice she encountered. Sometimes it was easier to just move on. But as she approached the aircraft door, she couldn't help but smile to herself. Patricia was in for quite a surprise when she learned who Eleanor's son was. Sometimes life had a way of delivering its own perfect lessons. Eleanor stepped onto the plane, ready to enjoy her first-class experience and, more importantly, the proud moment of being flown to Denver by her son, Captain Thomas Wilson, who had defied every obstacle placed in his path to become one of the airline's most respected pilots. Welcome aboard, Mrs. Wilson, greeted another flight attendant at the door. May I show you to your seat? Thank you, Eleanor replied, following her to seat 2A by the window. As she settled in, she gazed out at the tarmac, feeling a mixture of anticipation and maternal pride. In just a few hours, she would be in Denver, and the look on Patricia's face when she realized her mistake would be a story worth telling Thomas over dinner. Eleanor settled into her spacious first-class seat, placing her small carry-on bag beneath the seat in front of her. The leather seat was cool and comfortable, worlds away from the cramped economy seats she'd grown accustomed to over decades of travel. A middle-aged white businessman took the aisle seat next to her, giving her a brief nod before turning his attention to his phone. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering pre-flight beverages to first-class passengers. David, the kind flight attendant who had intervened at the gate, approached with a warm smile. "Would you care for something to drink before takeoff, Mrs. Wilson? Orange juice, water, or perhaps champagne?" "Orange juice would be lovely, thank you," Eleanor replied. David returned moments later with her drink. "I apologize for any confusion at the gate," he said quietly, leaning slightly closer. "I hope it didn't upset your travel experience." Eleanor appreciated his acknowledgement. "I've had worse," she said with a small smile. "But thank you." As David moved on to the next passenger, Eleanor noticed Patricia, the flight attendant from the gate, watching their interaction from the front of the cabin. The woman's face remained tight with what looked like disapproval. The plane gradually filled with passengers filing past toward the economy section. Eleanor sipped her juice and gazed out the window, watching the ground crew load luggage and prepare the aircraft for departure. Somewhere in the cockpit, her son Thomas was going through his pre-flight checklist, unaware of the small drama that had unfolded regarding his mother. The cabin door was about to close when Patricia approached Eleanor's seat. "Excuse me," she said, her tone professional but cool. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow but reached for her handbag and produced the boarding pass. Several nearby passengers glanced over, curious about the exchange. Patricia examined the pass with narrowed eyes. "There seems to be a discrepancy with our passenger manifest. How did you book this ticket?" The businessman beside Eleanor looked up from his phone, frowning slightly at the interruption. "My son purchased it for me," Eleanor replied calmly, though she could feel her heart rate increasing. "Is there a problem?" "Possibly," Patricia said. "We need to ensure everyone is in their assigned seats before takeoff. Security protocols." Eleanor had flown enough to know this was unusual. "The gate agent scanned my boarding pass without any issues, and David has already confirmed I'm in the correct seat." Patricia's lips thinned. "Nevertheless, I need to double-check. Can you tell me your son's name? The one who purchased this ticket?" "Thomas Wilson," Eleanor replied. Patricia made a show of checking a tablet she carried. "I don't see any notation about a Thomas Wilson purchasing this ticket." By now, other first-class passengers were openly watching the exchange. Eleanor felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation, but years of experience had taught her to remain composed in such situations. "Perhaps you could check with the gate agent who scanned my boarding pass," Eleanor suggested. "Or David, who has already verified I'm in the correct seat." "David isn't the lead flight attendant on this flight." "I am," Patricia replied, her voice taking on an edge. "And I'm responsible for ensuring all passengers are properly seated." The businessman next to Eleanor cleared his throat. "Excuse me," he said, addressing Patricia. "I couldn't help overhearing. Is there some kind of problem? We're all anxious to take off on time." Patricia turned to him with a completely different demeanor, all smiles and apologetic nods. "No problem, sir. Just a routine verification. Sorry for the disturbance." "Then perhaps we could get underway," he suggested, gesturing toward Eleanor. "The lady clearly has a first-class ticket, as you've now verified twice." Patricia's smile faltered. "Of course, sir." She turned back to Eleanor, handing her the boarding pass. "Everything appears to be in order after all. Enjoy your flight." The words were correct, but her tone suggested she remained unconvinced. As Patricia walked away, the businessman leaned toward Eleanor. "Some people let a little authority go to their heads," he said quietly. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, genuinely appreciative of his intervention. "Don't mention it, I'm Robert, by the way." "Eleanor." They shook hands briefly before returning to their respective personal spaces, Eleanor to her window, Robert to his phone. The safety demonstration began, with David and another female flight attendant demonstrating the oxygen masks and life vests, while Patricia narrated from the front of the cabin. Eleanor noticed how Patricia's gaze repeatedly drifted toward her seat during the presentation, as if she were still troubled by Eleanor's presence in first class. After the safety demonstration, the plane pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the runway. Eleanor felt the familiar pre-flight butterflies, though they were mixed now with a sense of unease from the confrontation with Patricia. She tried to focus on the joy of knowing Thomas was at the controls, piloting this massive machine with the skill and confidence he'd worked so hard to develop. The plane accelerated down the runway and lifted into the sky. Eleanor always loved this moment, the sensation of weight and gravity as the aircraft climbed into the clouds. Today it felt especially meaningful, knowing her son was responsible for this miracle of modern transportation. Once they reached cruising altitude, the seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight attendants began their in-flight service. David approached the first-class cabin with a drink cart, while Patricia worked her way through the economy section. "Another orange juice, Mrs. Wilson?" David asked when he reached her row. "Yes, please," Eleanor replied. "And perhaps you could tell me something. Is it standard procedure to verify boarding passes after passengers have already been seated?" David glanced quickly toward the back of the plane before answering. "Not typically, no. Once your boarding pass has been scanned at the gate, you're confirmed in the system." He handed her the juice. "I hope you weren't too inconvenienced." "I'm fine," Eleanor assured him. "Just curious about the protocol." David seemed about to say something more when Patricia appeared at the front of the cabin. He straightened and continued with his drink service. The flight progressed smoothly for the next hour. Eleanor read her e-book while Robert worked on his laptop beside her. The peaceful routine of the flight was interrupted when the overhead speaker crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Wilson speaking." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride at the sound of her son's confident voice. "We're cruising at an altitude of 36,000 feet with clear skies ahead. Our flight time to Denver is approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. The local weather in Denver is sunny, with a temperature of 75 degrees. The cabin crew will be coming through with a light meal service shortly. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." Eleanor couldn't help but smile. Thomas sounded so professional, so assured. She remembered the little boy who had built paper airplanes in their backyard, announcing his plans to fly real ones someday, despite teachers who told him to set more realistic goals. Patricia appeared with the meal cart a few minutes later, her professional smile firmly in place. When she reached Eleanor's row, however, the smile stiffened. "Chicken or pasta, ma'am?" she asked, her tone notably less warm than it had been with other passengers. "Chicken, please," Eleanor replied. Patricia handed her the meal without making eye contact. "Anything to drink with that?" "Just water, thank you." As Patricia poured the water, she accidentally on purpose tilted the cup, spilling a few drops onto the tray. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. She dabbed at the spill with a napkin before moving on to Robert's meal request. Eleanor ate her meal in silence, trying not to let Patricia's behavior spoil her excitement about seeing Thomas. The chicken was surprisingly good for airplane food, and the chocolate cake dessert was a sweet treat she hadn't expected. After the meal service, Eleanor needed to use the restroom. She waited until the aisle was clear before unbuckling her seatbelt and making her way forward to the first-class lavatory. As she approached, Patricia stepped directly in her path. "The first-class lavatory is reserved for first-class passengers," she said, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Eleanor stared at her in disbelief. "I am a first-class passenger," she replied, keeping her voice low and controlled despite her growing frustration. "Right," Patricia said, drawing out the word skeptically. "The economy lavatories are toward the rear of the aircraft." Before Eleanor could respond, David appeared beside them. "Is there a problem?" he asked, glancing between the two women. "No problem," Eleanor said firmly. "I was just explaining to Patricia, again, that I am indeed a first-class passenger, and I would like to use the first-class lavatory." David frowned at Patricia. "Mrs. Wilson is in seat 2A, Patricia. She's definitely a first-class passenger." Patricia's face flushed. "I was just ensuring—" "I'll handle this," David interrupted. "You should check if anyone needs anything in economy." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Patricia pressed her lips together but retreated toward the back of the plane. David turned to Eleanor with an apologetic expression. "I'm very sorry about that, Mrs. Wilson. The lavatory is free now." "Thank you, David," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She entered the lavatory and closed the door, finally allowing her composed facade to drop as she gripped the small sink. This kind of treatment wasn't new to her. The constant questioning, the suspicion, the assumption that she didn't belong in certain spaces. What made it more painful was knowing how hard Thomas had worked to provide her with this first-class experience, only to have it tainted by someone's prejudice. Eleanor took several deep breaths, reminding herself that she wouldn't let Patricia's behavior ruin this special trip. She splashed water on her face and reapplied her lipstick, straightening her shoulders before exiting the lavatory. As she walked back to her seat, she caught sight of Patricia whispering to another flight attendant while glancing in her direction. Eleanor held her head high and returned to her seat, determined to maintain her dignity despite Patricia's attempts to make her feel unwelcome. Little did Patricia know just how wrong her assumptions were, and Eleanor found herself looking forward to the moment when that would become abundantly clear. The flight continued with Eleanor doing her best to enjoy the experience despite Patricia's behavior. She had just returned to her novel when a light chime sounded, and the captain's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence ahead. I've turned on the fasten seatbelt sign as a precaution. Please return to your seats and make sure your seatbelts are securely fastened. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin." Eleanor smiled at the sound of Thomas's voice. Even in this brief announcement, she could hear the confident, steady man he had become. She remembered how he had struggled through flight school, working nights to pay for classes, studying until dawn, all while facing skepticism from instructors who seemed surprised by his aptitude. Now he commanded a commercial airliner with the easy authority of someone born to the role. The plane began to bounce slightly as it hit the predicted turbulence. David moved quickly through the cabin, checking that everyone was seated with their seatbelts fastened. Patricia remained in the economy section, steadying herself against the seats as she made her way forward. As the turbulence increased, a young woman across the aisle from Eleanor looked increasingly nervous, gripping her armrests with white knuckles. Eleanor noticed her shallow breathing and the panic in her eyes. "First time flying?" Eleanor asked gently. The woman nodded, her face pale. "Is this normal?" "Completely normal," Eleanor assured her. "Just like driving over a bumpy road. My son says turbulence might feel scary, but it's actually very routine for pilots." "Your son?" the woman asked, clearly grateful for the distraction from her fear. "He's a pilot," Eleanor said with a mother's pride. "Not for this airline, but he's taught me a lot about flying." The small lie came easily. She wasn't ready to reveal Thomas was actually flying this very plane. That revelation would come at the right moment. "That must be reassuring," the woman said, offering a weak smile as the plane dipped again. "I'm Eleanor," she said, extending her hand across the aisle. "Lily," the woman replied, reaching to shake. It just as a stronger bump caused her to gasp and pull back. "Here's what helps me," Eleanor said. "Focus on your breathing. In through your nose for 4 counts, hold for 2, then out through your mouth for 6. It tells your body that everything is fine." Lily tried the breathing technique, and after a few cycles, some color returned to her face. "That does help. Thank you." Eleanor continued chatting with Lily, distracting her from the turbulence with simple questions about her trip to Denver. She learned that Lily was a graphic designer traveling for a client meeting, her first major presentation since being promoted. Their conversation was interrupted when Patricia appeared, making her way to the front of the plane. As she passed Eleanor and Lily, she cast a suspicious glance at them. "Ladies, please keep your voices down during the turbulence," Patricia said. "Some passengers are trying to rest." Eleanor looked around. No one appeared to be sleeping, and their conversation had been quite subdued. "We'll be mindful," Eleanor replied politely, refusing to be baited into a confrontation. As Patricia continued toward the front of the plane, Lily leaned slightly across the aisle. Is it just me, or does she seem to have a problem with you specifically? Eleanor sighed. It's not just you. That's terrible, Lily said. Have you complained? Not yet, Eleanor replied. Sometimes it's exhausting to always have to be the one to point out these things. The seatbelt sign dinged off as the plane emerged from the patch of turbulence. Thomas's voice came over the intercom again. Thank you for your patience, folks. We've cleared that rough air and should have smooth sailing for the remainder of our flight to Denver. Flight attendants, you may resume cabin service. Lily visibly relaxed. Your breathing trick really helped. I might actually survive this flight after all. Eleanor smiled. You're doing great. David appeared with the beverage cart for a mid-flight service. He offered both women drinks with a friendly demeanor. Water, juice, coffee, or tea? Water, please, Eleanor said. I'll take a ginger ale, Lily added. Might help settle my stomach after that turbulence. As David served their drinks, Patricia returned from the front of the plane. She stood behind David, watching him interact with Eleanor. Her expression was hard to read, but there was something calculating in her gaze that made Eleanor uneasy. When David moved on, Patricia stepped forward. Mrs. Wilson, she said with forced politeness, could I speak with you for a moment? Eleanor felt all her senses go on alert. About what? A small matter regarding your ticket. If you could just step to the front with me. Eleanor's stomach tightened. She'd experienced this kind of targeting before. Being singled out, asked, to move, questioned in a way others weren't. But she'd be damned if she would be paraded to the front of the plane like a suspected criminal. Whatever you need to discuss can be said right here, Eleanor replied firmly but quietly. Patricia's smile thinned. This is a private matter about your reservation. Robert, who had been working on his laptop beside Eleanor, looked up. Is there a problem with all first-class reservations or just hers? He asked pointedly. Patricia's eyes flickered to him. This is an airline matter, sir. Then perhaps it should wait until we land, he suggested. Unless there's some urgent safety concern? Patricia hesitated, clearly weighing her options. Fine, Mrs. Wilson. Our system shows some inconsistency with how your ticket was purchased. It appears to have been obtained using an employee family benefit, but we have no record of you being related to any of our staff. Eleanor felt a flash of both anger and amusement. So that was it? Patricia couldn't believe a black woman her age could legitimately be in first class unless she had somehow cheated the system. My ticket was purchased properly, Eleanor stated, by my son, and I would appreciate not being accused of fraud in front of other passengers. By now, several nearby passengers were watching the exchange with interest. Patricia seemed to realize she was creating a scene. Her cheeks flushed slightly. I'm simply following protocol, she insisted. If you can't verify your relationship to the employee whose benefits were used, we may need to address this matter upon landing. Eleanor took a deep breath, weighing her options. She could reveal Thomas was the captain now, which would immediately end this harassment. But something in her wanted Patricia to face the full impact of her mistake later. I'll be happy to verify anything required upon landing, Eleanor said calmly. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to enjoy the remainder of my flight in peace. Patricia looked like she wanted to say more but thought better of it. Very well, she said stiffly before walking away. Lily leaned across the aisle again. That was ridiculous. She's clearly targeting you. Not my first rodeo, Eleanor said with a resigned smile. Robert closed his laptop. You handled that very gracefully, but you shouldn't have to. Would you like me to speak to the lead flight attendant? I'm a frequent flyer with this airline, and that kind of behavior is unacceptable. Eleanor appreciated his offer but shook her head. Thank you, but I have a feeling this will resolve itself soon enough. The remainder of the flight passed with Patricia making herself scarce in the first-class cabin. Instead, David handled their section, providing attentive service with genuine warmth. When he came to collect trash before landing, Eleanor asked if she could speak with him privately. He leaned down, and Eleanor whispered, I believe Patricia thinks I've used an employee benefit improperly. I wanted you to know that my son, Thomas Wilson, is actually the captain of this flight. David's eyes widened in surprise. Then he broke into a grin. Captain Wilson is your son? He's one of our most respected pilots. Yes, he is, Eleanor said, with pride. I'd appreciate if you kept that information to yourself for now. I'll be meeting him after we land. Of course, David agreed, straightening up. It'll be our secret. He moved on with his duties, but Eleanor caught him glancing at Patricia with an amused expression that clearly confused the lead flight attendant. As the plane began its descent into Denver, Eleanor felt a mixture of emotions. She was excited, to see Thomas, of course, but she also felt a weariness that came from yet another confrontation based on someone else's prejudice. Throughout her life, she'd faced countless Patricias, people who looked at her and saw only their own narrow assumptions. The plane banked smoothly, offering a spectacular view of the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Eleanor thought about how far Thomas had come, from the boy who had built paper airplanes to the man now guiding this massive aircraft through the sky with such skill. She'd raised him to face obstacles with determination and dignity, just as she had always tried to do. The captain's voice came over the intercom one final time. Flight attendants, prepare for landing. Eleanor fastened her seatbelt and put away her e-reader. Beside her, Robert did the same with his laptop. Safe travels in Denver, he said. And for what it's worth, I think you showed remarkable restraint back there. Thank you, Eleanor replied. Sometimes that's all you can do. The plane descended through wispy clouds, the ground growing closer with each passing moment. Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of her ears popping as the aircraft lost altitude. Soon they were low enough to make out cars on the highways, then individual buildings, then finally the runway itself. With a gentle bump and the roar of reversed engines, they touched down at Denver International Airport. Eleanor smiled to herself. Thomas had always been good at smooth landings, even in the flight simulator games he'd played as a teenager. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver, came the announcement as the plane taxied toward the gate. The local time is 2:45 p.m. and the temperature is a pleasant 75 degrees. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we reach the gate, and the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. On behalf of Southern Airways and our entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. As the plane pulled up to the gate, Eleanor prepared herself for what would come next. Patricia would soon learn exactly who Eleanor Wilson was, and that moment had been a long time coming. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and passengers immediately began reaching for their overhead bags despite the flight attendant's announcement to remain seated until the aircraft came to a complete stop. Eleanor stayed in her seat, in no rush to join the usual chaos of deplaning. She knew Thomas would need time to complete his post-flight checklist and paperwork before he could meet her. Patricia appeared at the front of the cabin, her professional smile firmly in place as she thanked passengers for flying with Southern Airways. When her gaze landed on Eleanor, however, the smile faltered. Eleanor could almost see her mentally preparing for their next encounter. Need any help with your bag? Robert asked as he stood up beside Eleanor. No, thank you, Eleanor replied. I'm waiting for the crowd to thin out anyway. Smart move, he agreed, retrieving his briefcase from the overhead bin. It was a pleasure sitting next to you, Eleanor. I hope the rest of your visit to Denver is less eventful than the flight. I have a feeling it's about to get more interesting, Eleanor said with a small smile. But thank you. Safe travels to you as well. As Robert made his way off the plane, Lily also stood to leave. Thanks again for helping me through the turbulence, she said to Eleanor. And good luck with... She glanced meaningfully toward Patricia. Thank you, dear, Eleanor replied. Good luck with your presentation. You'll do wonderfully. Lily smiled gratefully before joining the line of passengers moving toward the exit. Eleanor remained seated, watching as the first-class cabin gradually emptied. David passed by, giving her a knowing wink that Patricia, busy farther down the aisle, didn't notice. Finally, when most passengers had deplaned, Eleanor gathered her belongings and stood. Patricia immediately approached, blocking her path to the exit. Mrs. Wilson, I need to speak with you about your ticket before you leave. Eleanor sighed. What seems to be the problem, Patricia? Our system indicates your ticket was purchased using an employee family benefit code, Patricia said, her tone accusatory. That benefit is only available to immediate family members of Southern Airways employees. Using it fraudulently is a serious violation. I assure you I used no such benefit fraudulently, Eleanor replied calmly. Then you'll need to explain your relationship to the employee whose code was used, Patricia insisted. Otherwise, I'll have to report this to security. Before Eleanor could respond, a young flight attendant Eleanor hadn't seen before hurried up the aisle. Patricia, she said breathlessly, Captain Wilson is asking for you in the cockpit immediately. Patricia frowned at the interruption. I'm handling a situation here, Alicia. Tell him I'll be there shortly. He was very insistent, Alicia replied, looking uncomfortable. He said it's urgent. Patricia's frown deepened. Fine. She turned back to Eleanor. Don't leave the aircraft. This matter isn't resolved. As Patricia headed toward the cockpit, David appeared beside Eleanor. Perfect timing, he said with a smile. Would you like me to escort you to the jet bridge? I believe someone might be waiting for you there. Thank you, David, Eleanor said, gathering her carry-on. I appreciate your kindness throughout this flight. It was my pleasure, he replied sincerely. And I'm looking forward to what happens next, if I'm honest. They walked together to the aircraft door. Eleanor could hear muffled voices coming from the cockpit, but couldn't make out the words. Just as she reached the exit, the cockpit door opened, and Thomas emerged in his captain's uniform, his gold stripes gleaming on his shoulders. Behind him, Patricia stood frozen in the cockpit doorway, her face a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Mom, Thomas called out, his face lighting up with a broad smile. He strode down the aisle with confident steps, his tall frame commanding the space. At 42, Thomas Wilson had the same warm brown eyes as his mother and the strong jawline of his late father. There's my boy, Eleanor said, her heart swelling with pride as it always did when she saw him in his uniform. Thomas enveloped her in a tight hug. How was your flight? He asked, pulling back to look at her. Interesting, Eleanor replied. A wealth of meaning in that single word. Thomas's smile dimmed slightly as he studied her face. Everything okay? We can talk about it later, Eleanor said, patting his arm reassuringly. But Thomas had already turned to look back at Patricia, who had finally emerged from the cockpit and was standing halfway down the aisle, her face pale. Is there something we need to discuss now, Mom? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded toward Patricia. That flight attendant seems to believe I've used an employee benefit fraudulently. Thomas's expression hardened. Is that so? He turned fully toward Patricia. Would you care to explain why you think my mother has done something improper? The color drained from Patricia's face as she realized her mistake. Your mother? She repeated, her voice barely audible. Yes, Thomas confirmed, his tone professional but cool. Eleanor Wilson, my mother, who appears to have been given a rather difficult time on my flight, based on what I'm hearing from multiple crew members. Patricia seemed to shrink under his gaze. Captain Wilson, there must have been some misunderstanding. I was simply following protocol regarding employee benefit verification. Interesting, Thomas replied. Because in my 15 years with this airline, I've never heard of flight attendants conducting such verifications mid-flight. That's typically handled at the booking stage. By now, David and Alicia were watching the exchange with undisguised interest, along with a few remaining passengers who had slowed their exit to witness the unfolding drama. I was just being thorough, Patricia insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Were you equally thorough with all passengers using employee benefits today? Thomas asked. Or just my mother? Patricia had no answer for that. Thomas turned back to Eleanor. Mom, did anything else happen during the flight that I should know about? Eleanor considered the question. She could detail every slight, every suspicious glance, every unnecessary challenge Patricia had created. Part of her wanted to see the woman face consequences for her behavior. But another part, the part that had navigated a lifetime of similar encounters, recognized that public humiliation rarely led to genuine change. There were some misunderstandings, Eleanor said carefully. Patricia seemed convinced I didn't belong in first class. She checked my boarding pass multiple times, questioned how I obtained my ticket, and directed me to economy facilities despite my first-class seat assignment. Thomas's jaw tightened. He turned back to Patricia, whose face now showed a mixture of embarrassment and fear. "Captain Wilson, I can explain," she began. Thomas raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "I think I understand the situation perfectly." His voice was controlled but carried an undercurrent of anger. My mother, a guest on this aircraft and a first-class passenger with a valid ticket that I personally purchased, was repeatedly harassed during a flight under my command. Patricia looked down at the floor. "That wasn't my intention." "Intentions matter less than actions," Thomas replied. "And your actions made my mother feel unwelcome and uncomfortable on my aircraft. That's unacceptable." The remaining passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. A few had even taken out their phones, though they weren't openly recording the confrontation yet. Thomas seemed to notice the growing audience. He turned to David. "Would you please escort my mother to the gate? I'll join her shortly after I complete some paperwork." "Of course, Captain," David replied promptly. Thomas then addressed Patricia with the quiet authority that had earned him respect throughout the airline. "We'll continue this discussion in private. Please wait for me in the crew room." Patricia nodded mutely and moved toward the exit, careful to avoid eye contact with Eleanor as she passed. Thomas gave his mother another quick hug. "I'll meet you at baggage claim in 20 minutes, Mom. David will make sure you get there comfortably." "Don't be too hard on her, Thomas," Eleanor said quietly. "Sometimes people need room to recognize their mistakes." Thomas's expression softened as he looked at his mother. "Always teaching me even now," he said with a small smile. "I'll keep that in mind. See you soon." As David escorted Eleanor off the plane, she could feel the curious gazes of the remaining crew members. Word had clearly spread quickly about what had happened. "That was quite a moment," David commented as they walked down the jet bridge. "Captain Wilson is one of our most respected pilots. Patricia picked the wrong passenger to hassle." "She picked the wrong approach to her job," Eleanor corrected gently. "This isn't about who I know. It's about treating all passengers with dignity." David nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, of course, but I can't say I'm not enjoying the justice of it all a little bit." As they entered the terminal, Eleanor noticed a small crowd of passengers from the flight lingering nearby, including Lily and Robert. From their expressions, it was clear they had witnessed at least part of the confrontation. "Was that the captain? Who hugged you?" Lily asked, approaching with wide eyes. "The one you said wasn't your son?" Eleanor smiled apologetically. "A small deception, I'm afraid. Thomas is indeed my son, but I wasn't ready to reveal that during the flight." "I don't blame you," Robert said, joining them. The look on that flight attendant's face when she realized her mistake was priceless. "It's not about humiliating her," Eleanor said firmly. "It's about hoping she might think differently next time she makes assumptions about a passenger." Robert nodded with newfound respect. "You're a better person than most, Mrs. Wilson." "Not better," Eleanor replied. "Just tired of the cycle of judgment and retaliation. At some point, someone has to break it." David checked his watch. "Mrs. Wilson, can I help you to baggage claim? Captain Wilson will be meeting you there shortly." "Thank you, David," Eleanor said, turning to say goodbye to Lily and Robert. "It was lovely meeting you both, despite the circumstances." As Eleanor walked away with David, she heard Lily say to Robert, "I want to be like her when I grow up." Eleanor smiled to herself. Perhaps some good had come from this difficult experience after all. If even one person walked away with a new perspective, that was something worth celebrating. She made her way toward baggage claim, where her son would soon join her, ready to share stories over dinner about his life in Denver and her grandchildren's latest adventures. The incident with Patricia would become just another story, a reminder of how far they'd come and how far society still had to go. 3 days later, Eleanor sat in Thomas's backyard, watching her grandchildren play on the swing. Sit. 7-year-old Zoe pushed her younger brother James on the swing, both of them laughing as he demanded to go higher. Thomas's wife Andrea brought out a tray with lemonade and cookies, setting it on the patio table. The kids are loving having their grandma here, Andrea said, sitting beside Eleanor. James keeps asking why you don't live closer. Eleanor smiled, taking a glass of lemonade. It's tempting, especially seeing them grow so quickly. But my whole life is back in Atlanta. My friends, my book club, my volunteer work at the community center. I know, Andrea said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. But we treasure these visits, and speaking of visits, Thomas mentioned something happened on your flight here. Eleanor sighed. She'd shared the basics with Thomas but hadn't wanted to dwell on the incident. Just an unpleasant interaction with a flight attendant who made some assumptions about me. Andrea's expression darkened. Thomas was furious. I've rarely seen him that angry when he came home that night. He shouldn't let it bother him so much, Eleanor said. I've dealt with people like that my whole life. That's exactly why it bothers him, Andrea replied. The fact that his own mother still faces that kind of treatment even on his own flight, it hit him hard. Before Eleanor could respond, her phone chimed with a message notification. She picked it up, surprised to see an email from Southern Airways customer service. Everything okay? Andrea asked. I'm not sure, Eleanor replied, opening the email. It's from the airline. She read through the message, her eyebrows rising as she reached the end. Well? Andrea prompted. It's a formal apology from the airline regarding my experience, Eleanor explained. They're offering me free first-class tickets for my return flight and any future travel within the next year. Good, Andrea said firmly. It's the least they could do. Eleanor continued reading. There's more. They say they've initiated a comprehensive review of their crew training procedures regarding passenger interaction and bias awareness, and they've invited me to participate in a focus group to provide input on improving customer experiences. Are you going to do it? Andrea asked. Eleanor considered the question. I might. If it could help prevent someone else from going through the same thing. Her phone chimed again. Another email, this one addressed directly to her from the airline's Vice President of Customer Experience, who had apparently heard about the incident from several sources. The message was both apologetic and appreciative of her grace under pressure, as the VP put it. Andrea leaned back in her chair, watching Eleanor's face as she read. Thomas said you were remarkably calm throughout the whole ordeal. I would have lost my mind if someone treated me that way. Getting angry rarely helps, Eleanor said, setting down her phone. I learned that a long time ago. Still, you must have felt some satisfaction when that flight attendant realized who you were. Eleanor smiled slightly. I won't deny that. But you know what felt better? The way David, that was the kind flight attendant, stood up for me before anyone knew I was Thomas's mother, and how some of the other passengers noticed what was happening and spoke up too. The back door opened, and Thomas stepped out, still dressed in his uniform. He'd just returned from a short regional flight. There, he is, Eleanor said, her face lighting up at the sight of her son. Daddy! Zoe and James abandoned the swing set and ran to Thomas, who scooped up James and hugged Zoe with his free arm. How are my favorite people doing? He asked, carrying James while Zoe held his hand as they approached the patio. We're having cookies with Grandma, Zoe announced, and she promised to read us 3 stories before bedtime. 3 whole stories. That's quite a deal you negotiated, Thomas said, setting James down and kissing Andrea hello before turning to Eleanor. How are you doing, Mom? Just fine, Eleanor assured him. How was your flight? Smooth, Thomas replied, loosening his tie and taking a cookie from the plate. Nothing nearly as eventful as our flight together. About that, Eleanor said, holding up her phone. I've just received some very apologetic emails from your airline. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. I heard they'd be contacting you. After I filed my report about the incident, it apparently went straight to upper management. What happened with Patricia? Eleanor asked. I've been wondering. Thomas took a seat at the table. She's been temporarily removed from flight duties. Pending completion of additional training. You mean she's suspended? Andrea asked. Not exactly. She's still working, but in a ground-based customer service role while she completes a pretty intensive bias awareness and professional conduct program. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. I hope it helps her gain some perspective. That's not all, Thomas added. She asked to speak with me yesterday before my flight. She wanted to know if I could pass along an apology to you. Eleanor raised her eyebrows in surprise. Did she now? Thomas took a sip of lemonade. She seemed genuinely remorseful, said she'd been doing a lot of reflection since the incident. Apparently several crew members and even a few passengers filed complaints about how she treated you. That would be Robert and Lily, I suspect, Eleanor said. They witnessed most of it. Well, it made an impression. Patricia admitted she had made assumptions about you based on... Thomas glanced at his children who were now back at the swing set and chose his words carefully. Based on factors that had nothing to do with your ticket or your behavior. People don't change overnight, Eleanor said, but acknowledging, a mistake is a start. She also asked if she could apologize to you directly, Thomas added. I told her I'd ask if you were open to that. Eleanor considered this. Maybe, not right away, but perhaps before I leave. Andrea looked skeptical. You're more forgiving than I would be. It's not about forgiveness, Eleanor explained. It's about breaking cycles. If Patricia truly wants to do better, shutting her down serves no purpose. The conversation paused as James ran over, asking for help with his shoelace. Thomas knelt down to tie it, and Eleanor watched the interaction with a full heart. This was why she had always emphasized dignity and resilience to her children, so they could move through the world with confidence despite its flaws. After dinner that evening, when the children were in bed, Thomas, Andrea, and Eleanor sat in the living room with glasses of wine. I found out something interesting today, Thomas said. Remember David, the flight attendant who was kind to you? Eleanor nodded. Of course, he made quite a difference during that flight. Apparently he's been advocating for updated training protocols for months. He's part of a diversity committee at the airline that's been pushing for changes in how crew members are trained to interact with passengers of all backgrounds. That doesn't surprise me, Eleanor said. He seemed like someone who understood the importance of treating people with respect. The airline has asked him to help develop the new training program, Thomas continued. And get this, he mentioned you as an inspiration. Said the way you handled the situation showed exactly the kind of dignity they should be teaching their staff to embody. Eleanor felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. That's very kind of him. It's deserved, Andrea insisted. From what Thomas told me, you were a model of grace under pressure. Eleanor smiled. I've had practice. The conversation shifted to other topics. Zoe's upcoming school play, James's sudden interest in dinosaurs, the neighborhood block party planned for the following month. Eleanor listened contentedly, grateful for these precious days with her family. Later that night, as she prepared for bed in Thomas's guest room, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the incident. Throughout her life, she had faced countless Patricias, people who looked at her and saw only their preconceived notions rather than the accomplished woman she was. She had weathered these encounters with her dignity intact, teaching her children to do the same. But something felt different this time. The swift response from the airline, the support from strangers like Robert and Lily, David's commitment to making changes, even Patricia's request to apologize, all suggested that perhaps the world was shifting, however slowly. Her phone chimed, with a text message from Thomas. Forgot to tell you, several pilots and crew members have asked to meet you tomorrow at the family day picnic. You've become something of a legend at the airline. Love you, Mom. Eleanor smiled as she typed her reply. Looking forward to it. And Thomas, I'm proud of how you handled everything. Love you too. She set her phone on the nightstand and turned out the light. As she drifted towards sleep, Eleanor thought about the focus group the airline had invited her to join. Perhaps she would participate after all. If her experience could help create a more respectful environment for future travelers, that would transform an unpleasant incident into something meaningful. That had always been her approach to life's challenges, finding ways to turn difficult moments into opportunities for growth, not just for herself, but for everyone involved. It wasn't always easy, and progress often came in small increments rather than dramatic leaps. But as she had told Andrea, breaking cycles required patience and persistence. In the morning, she would call the airline and accept their invitation, and perhaps before returning to Atlanta, she would meet with Patricia as well, not for Patricia's sake but for her own, to complete the circle and move forward with the same grace and dignity that had carried her through 70 years of both struggles and triumphs. As sleep claimed her, Eleanor's final thought was of Thomas in his captain's uniform, standing tall in the aircraft aisle, living proof that while the journey might be difficult, the destination was worth every step.